2012. My topic this morning is Liberating the Oppressed, Defining Freedom, Slavery, and Justice. And my goal is to kind of push a little bit on how we define some of these terms, particularly slavery. And I think you'll see where we're heading with that. And I have a short presentation, hopefully it'll be short, and because I want time for us to dialogue a bit too. And so let me jump in and we will start. Oops, if I can get this to come out here now. Okay. We'll start with defining freedom. Several years ago we had a guest speaker on campus for the School of Business, and he said if both parties agree to the terms, there is no such thing as exploitation. Something that I kind of disagree with, and I want to unpack that a little bit. Both parties agreed to it, no such thing as exploitation. If that is the case, what's wrong with pedophilia? And you know what I mean by pedophilia? Child molestation, something like that. What if both parties agree? You have a 13-year-old and a 30-year-old who agree to have sex. What's wrong with that? Good answer. Is that what you're going to say?
Not exactly. Both parties aren't available the same amount of information.
Okay, and one party's not in a good position to say no. Is that fair to say? I mean, that's what I would argue. The power imbalance, one party's not in a good position to say no. Similarly, that's why we have laws against not just pedophilia, but also sexual harassment. If a boss is harassing a subordinate, coercing to have sex, we could say, well, she consented, but she consented under terms of unequal power in that condition. And that's part of what I want to argue. If it applies in the bedroom, so to speak, it should also apply in the boardroom. That is, if both parties aren't able to say no, if there's a real unequal distribution of power between the two. And as I got thinking about this, I would argue maybe the worst form of slavery is when the cage doors open, but there's no place to go. That is, there are no other options available. And we tend to think of slavery as only when there's physical coercion involved. But there's physical coercion and economic coercion and emotional coercion that can be involved in slavery. And I want to be clear, I was at a workshop years ago, and we were talking about racism, and someone said, well, I'm left-handed and I get discriminated against too. And as the discussion went on, it was fairly clear that they were trying to diffuse the anger around racism. That's not my goal, to diffuse anger around slavery. But it is my goal to say there are other forms of oppression or exploitation, and we need to expand to those and not just stop at a limited definition of slavery when we begin to think about this. And as long as we're talking about freedom, Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, said once, the central problem is free individuals situated in massive and oppressive structures which alienate and constrain their activity. And what I'm arguing is those structures, be they physical, economic, social, those are things that are chains of various sorts, and those are things that keep people from being free and freely choosing. And I'll give some very specific examples of this in a bit. Let me say now too that if you have a question or comment anywhere along the line, just flag me down and we'll start the dialogue. Slavery, I'm arguing, is a symptom of a larger problem, and the problem is extreme inequality. Economist magazine had an article on this just a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it was the feature article, and throughout the whole issue, some arguments about the problem of extreme inequality. Now, I'm not one that argues for complete equality. I like it when people who work harder get rewarded better and things like that. But when inequality becomes really extreme, the consequences are pretty severe. And these next things come from, well, my own ponderings, but also a UN report in 2000. And in 2000, the UN was looking at inequality globally, and they said the three richest men in the world, who at that time were Bill Gates, Paul Allen, and Warren Buffett. Bill Gates and Paul Allen were both at Microsoft. Their combined net worth was greater than the gross domestic product of the 47 poorest countries in the world combined. So you have 3 people and 47 countries, and the 3 people have more wealth than the 47 poorest countries in the world. Now since then, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have both committed to giving away good amounts of their wealth, and I commend them for that. At that time, they also reported that Bill Gates had $100 billion. I don't know about you, but I don't have a lot to do with numbers like 100 billion very often. And so I was trying to make sense of what $100 billion looks like. And I decided, well, what if I was hired to count Bill Gates' money? I'm going to work 40 hours a week and I'm going to count his money, and it's all in $100 bills. And so I'm going to count it at $200 a second. Well, at $200 a second, I could count $720,000 in an hour. That would take me to 28.8 million in a week. That's a lot of money. But in a year, I'd have only counted about 1.5 billion. And if I started counting when I was 18 and retired when I was 66, I would have only gotten to 71 billion. I wouldn't have been able to count $100 billion at that rate in a typical working lifetime. So that's what $100 billion, that's one way of thinking about it. The other way I looked at it is, if you started spending at the rate of $20,000 a day, and you started when Jesus was born, you would still be spending at the rate of $20,000 a day trying to get rid of $100 billion. Now, that's only working 5 days a week because shopping makes you tired and all of that. But that's what $100 billion would look like, and that's assuming no interest. If you were getting 2% interest, you would have been making money that whole time, and so forth. So that's, and then when you contrast that, half the world's population lives on $2 a day or less. And there's about 1 billion people in the world that live on $1 a day or less. And some of those people live in my new homeland, Guatemala. Some pretty wretched poverty there, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Any questions on this before I move on? Or comments? Okay. There's an organization in Guatemala called As Green as It Gets, and they're doing their math in quetzales, which is why you see all these Q's here. And one of the points they're arguing in this article is that moving away from slavery was actually good for business owners, but bad for workers. Now again, they're not arguing that slavery was good or anything like that, but they were doing the math, and if you owned a pair of slaves in the southern U.S. in 1865, and you adjust for inflation, and again, they're looking at quetzales, it cost about $1,000 to buy a slave. Again, if you adjust for inflation and all that. So they're calculating that on kind of a daily basis for 2 slaves, and it would cost 28 quetzales per day, which is about $3.50 per day. Food costs would be about 65 quetzales per day, housing costs 17 quetzales per day, medicine, and you're going to want to provide medicine for the slaves because you have an investment. I mean, you've paid $1,000 for this slave, you can't afford to have the slave get sick, and so you're going to care for them, and so forth. So it costs the business owner about 115 quetzales a day, which is roughly $15. On the right, this is current wages in Guatemala, and this is what they're describing as an independently contracted slave, someone who agreed to do this, and this takes us back to, is there exploitation if both parties agreed to it? What they're saying is the daily wage comes to 105 quetzales, 10 quetzales less than it would have cost the business owner under slavery, and not enough to sustain someone. And this would apply to sugarcane workers, the southern part of Guatemala, a lot of people cutting sugarcane, other parts, coffee pickers, and things like that. And the advantage to the business owner of the non-slavery system is if the slave gets sick, you just hire, or the worker will say, the worker gets sick, you just hire the next one in line. You don't have to worry about health care, and it's their problem of whether or not they have a place to sleep at night, etc., etc. And part of what I'm arguing is the wages are so low, and corporations have been so busy scouring the earth for the most desperate people that we have slave labor without chains. That's essentially the argument I'm making. And part of what I'm saying is to address the problem of slavery, without addressing the problem of global poverty and global inequality will not change anything. You may rescue one person who's trafficked here, and 2 more are waiting in line to take their place. And until inequality is changed pretty seriously, that dynamic will continue. What is justice? In one of Socrates' dialogues, he engaged Thrasymachus in an exchange and asked Thrasymachus, "What is justice?" And Thrasymachus' reply was, "Justice is the interest of the stronger." Justice is the interest of the stronger. What's that mean? Yeah.
More powerful, whatever they see fit.
Yeah, basically, if you have the power, you get to decide what's just and what's fair. And it goes back to this power imbalance thing that I think is an important way of thinking about this. Justice is fairness. This is the title of a book by John Rawls, a philosopher. And usually when we think of justice, we probably think of retributive justice. The criminal justice system, we have this endless parade of cop shows on television and so forth. And so we often tend to think of justice in the realm of criminal justice, punishing people and so forth. When the Bible talks about justice, the Hebrew word in the Old Testament is mishpat. It's usually economic justice. It's usually about distributive justice. When the people of Israel are given the promised land, God tells them, you're going to a land that's rich, and there will be no poor among you. Now we know from the yelling of the Old Testament prophets that there were in fact poor. What God is saying is not a prophecy as much as it is a prescription. Because it's a rich land I'm giving you, there's no reason for there to be any poor among you. And that's about distributive justice. The sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee, are all things about distributive justice. Rawls also talks about what he calls the veil of ignorance, because the difficulty is trying to decide what a just distribution of profits looks like. Both the worker and the owner contribute to the generation of profits. Stockholders contribute, they provide capital. And so everybody should get something for their efforts. But how much any one person should get is not an easy question to answer. What Rawls argues is the closest you can come to fairness is whatever system you would design through a veil of ignorance. And what he means by this veil of ignorance, assume we're designing a system. We don't know at the beginning what role we're going to occupy within that system. That's what he means by a veil of ignorance. And so we don't know if we're going to be one of the stockholders or one of the workers. If you didn't know, but you're going to be part of this system, how would that affect your decisions about designing the system? I mean, just in case you're one of the CEOs or one of the stockholders, you're going to want to make sure you get rewarded for that, but you're also going to want to make sure the odds are that you're going to end up one of the workers, that at the very least I have a decent life, that I can eat and I can have a place to sleep and clothes and maybe buy an iPod or maybe an iPad even, or something like that. And so through this veil of ignorance, we would probably come closer to what's a just system that accommodates, on the one hand, differences in inputs, who's contributing more, but on the other hand, making sure everybody gets kind of a fair wage and things like that. Instead, I think what we have is closer to what we've been talking about. Whoever has the most power gets to decide how things are distributed. In the last decade, Forbes, Fortune, Business Week have all had articles about the correlation between CEO compensation and productivity and profitability. And their basic conclusion is there's not a very strong correlation. It's not that the companies that are more productive and more profitable have higher paid CEOs. It's more about the positional power of the CEO to claim higher levels of wages and so forth. And workers have very little positional power in that negotiating process. So, I don't know if we'll answer it, but I'm raising the question about what is a just wage, and that's what I want you to think about a bit. And finally, my final slide, when we talk about oppression, and what I want to argue is that this is a serious biblical theme. The word oppress shows up a lot. What's the central event of the Old Testament? Central historical event. What's that? The Exodus, the deliverance from bondage in Egypt is, and that's what Jesus is celebrating, the Passover at the Last Supper. And so this is a pivotal point. It's referred back to again and again in the Psalms when we were in bondage in Egypt and so forth. And so oppression's a biblical theme. The Hebrew word literally means to crush. And this is something a theme that runs throughout, and I'll talk more about Jesus in that regard in just a second. The bondage in Egypt, the Hebrew prophets, especially read Amos. I often go back to either angry Amos or Jeremiah, who's called the weeping prophet. And one of my spiritual directors once told me, beneath all anger is a profound sadness. And I'd kind of like to be like angry Amos. It's more fun being angry than weeping. But unfortunately, my calling has called me back again and again to weep for oppression and for the oppressed in that sense. And so the Hebrew prophets, Amos saying, you sell the needy for a pair of sandals. Today he might say, you sell the needy for a pair of Nikes. We'll get into that in a second. And so the Hebrew prophets, again, if you remember Amos 5:22 through 24, I'm tired of your solemn assemblies. The noise of your songs makes me sick. I hate your praise teams. Well, not exactly. I'm paraphrasing slightly. But it goes on to say, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And that theme of justice instead of oppression is a dominant theme throughout Scripture, through the Old Testament. And then in skipping to Jesus' inaugural address, Jesus walks into the synagogue, picks up the scroll, reads from Isaiah 61, which says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to break good news to the poor, to set at liberty the captives, restore sight to the blind, liberate the oppressed, and proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Liberate the oppressed and proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And the acceptable year of the Lord was a metaphor for the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee, slaves freed, debts forgiven, all land returned to original owners. And this would have been huge in Galilee. At that point in time in first century Israel, most Galileans had been dispossessed of their land. Their own version of subprime lending foreclosures. So it's not a new idea. But people had loaned money at exorbitant interest, which was forbidden by Hebrew law, lost their land, and so most of the Galileans were working as peasant sharecroppers. And so for Jesus to be in Galilee saying this verse, because then he goes on to say, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. Just imagine what that would have felt like to those listening. Jesus declaring the year of Jubilee and declaring freedom from oppression and so forth. Because they're not just oppressed by landowners, distant landowners, they're also oppressed by the Roman occupation, and so you have people that are oppressed a whole bunch of different ways. And so to talk about liberating the oppressed in that context. And that's just the beginning for Jesus, because especially if you read through Luke's gospel, it goes from that to the rich young ruler. I talked in chapel Monday about the parable of the talents or minas, and that comes right after the rich young ruler, right after Zacchaeus, and Jesus confronts Zacchaeus for some of his fraudulent activities, and right before Jesus rides into Jerusalem and does the temple takeover. From Sunday through Thursday, he's preaching in the temple daily, and people are trying to figure out what to do with him because he's challenging an unjust economic system and challenging the exploitation that's going on in Israel at that point in time. Okay, let me see what kinds of questions. I do have a video I can show, but I'd rather get to your questions, and then if you would like, we will, if we don't have a lot of questions, we can take a few minutes to look at portions of this video. Yes?
A lot of people have argued that the Bible supports slavery with treat your slaves well.
Yeah.
And passages like that. How would you respond?
Paul saying slaves obey your masters and that kind of thing. Yes? Yes, I will. The question was, some would argue that the Bible supports slavery because you're right, there's not much there that says slavery's wrong. Paul says slaves obey your masters, so there's nothing there where he's challenging that directly. I think especially in the writings of Paul, we have to take those in context. Paul also says wear head coverings in church for women and other things like that, that we see today as being somewhat culturally dependent. Paul's writing in the context of a particular culture at a particular point in time. But I think when looked at in the larger biblical theme of human dignity, of justice, of freedom from oppression, I think that's how we got where we got. The sad thing is it took us 1900 years to get there, or 1850 we could say, or something like that. And that's part of what we have to look at is, one of my theology profs used to say, every conception of God is a misconception. And by that he meant God is so far beyond our ability to know that we're still trying to figure out certain things. And that's one that it took us, I think, 1800 plus years to figure out. And at the same time, the role of women in the church is another one where, again, Paul's often quoted, but we have changed quite a bit just in my lifetime. And B.T. Roberts, the founder of the Free Methodist Church, who opposed slavery, also in 1892 wrote a book called Ordaining Women, in which he argued for full egalitarian relationships between men and women. And so we're still getting it, is part of what I'm saying. And I think there are things we don't get today, 2,000 years later, that we're working toward.
So what do we do about this here in Spring Arbor, Michigan?
That's the tough question. And it's hard to, I used to be arrogant enough to say, you should do this and this and this and this. Now I've learned to say, start on your knees and ask God that question, because it's different for different people. My calling, which I've run from more than once, like Jonah, is to speak. And I had a moment of crisis years ago when I'm literally beside the side of my bed saying, you know, you got the wrong guy. I like to be liked. And when I talk about this stuff, it just makes people mad. So could you find somebody else to talk about these things, please? But I got to what I call my Gethsemane moment. And that is, not my will, but yours be done. If this is what you want, I'm all in. And I think what each individual is supposed to do depends a little on their gifts, their calling, the passions. And I think if we listen to those points where we're either called to speak or called to act. But part of what I look at, I've been to Washington, D.C. 4 times with groups of students most often to harass my senators and congressmen into caring about the poor. There are lots of lobbyists on Capitol Hill. There aren't a lot of lobbyists for the poor and the oppressed. And we've met with them, and we've, right before the latest increase in minimum wage, we met with them, and that was one of the things we were arguing for, is workers need a better wage. Slavery in Guatemala, or oppression and economic oppression in Guatemala, is very visible. It's not quite as obvious here, but when workers are working at 30-hour-a-week jobs and can't get any benefits because of that, 44.5% of poor families in America have a family member working full-time. And there was a time when one wage of a full-time worker could support a family. And that, I'm afraid, is long gone. And we have fewer full-time workers, more part-time workers. And so I think we have to push, whether it's corporations or Congress, push whoever's in power to ask that question about, what about the poor, the widow, the alien, the orphan? What are we doing there? And in the last, I don't know how many elections, you very seldom hear people talk about the poor. It's the middle class. Everybody talks about them, and both parties. I'm not being partisan here. It's the middle class that people are shooting for. And the reason they're shooting for the middle class is the poor are so cynical, they've given up on voting. Doesn't matter who we vote for, we're going to get the shaft either way. And so speak on behalf of the poor when we can. And it could be in the context of a university, a town, whatever, but to push for fair treatment. My daughter used to work for an organization that did congregation-based community organizing. And in Ohio, one of their accomplishments, do you guys know about payday advance places? It's not an accident that they've sprung up all over Jackson, probably 20, 30 payday advance places, some of whom charge 450% annual percentage rate. Now that used to be against the law, and it should be against the law. It's obscene. In Ohio, this organization got together and they got a cap of 32%. Now that's still an obscenely high interest rate, but it's a lot better than 450%. And this was a network of churches that came together and basically said, look, it's mostly poor, desperate people who are doing these payday advances, and then they can't pay it back, and so it's rolled over, and it just accumulates and accumulates, and it's a form of slavery in its own right. It becomes a form of bondage when they can't repay their debts. And so whether it's dealing with fairer wages and fairer treatment and less exploitation here, certainly the majority of the world's population is in really wretched poverty. And it's the same thing. All over Guatemala there are maquiladoras, Korean factories that locate in Guatemala to produce for U.S. companies. Liz Claiborne, Gap, Nike, and so forth. And the workers in those factories are paid very low wages, terrible working conditions. I was in a free zone in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And a free zone is a place that opens up and they invite foreign corporations to locate there, and they don't have to pay any taxes if they hire Jamaican workers, in this case. And there are free zones all over the third world, or the developing world. And I walked around with this guy, and workers were paid $1 an hour in Jamaica, and they were sewing Hanes underwear. If you're wearing Hanes, it may say assembled in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Don't check now. Wait till you get home. So I talked to him. I said, you know, the wages aren't that much different than they could make doing other jobs in Jamaica. It's not better wages. Do the workers ever try to organize to form a union? He said, we're set up so that if they go on strike today, we can be in Puerto Rico tomorrow. And we'll hire a new batch of workers and open up, and same thing. And the workers know that. And so by pitting workers, desperately poor people around the world against each other, they're able to keep wages very low and very suppressed because people are fearful of losing the little bit they've got in those circumstances. And some have talked about the need for a universal living wage. And a universal living wage would be calibrated to the cost of living in each country, because my cost of living in Guatemala is a lot less than it would be here in the U.S. But basically say a living wage is enough that one income, one full-time job, could provide the basic necessities, food, clothing, and shelter for an average-sized family kind of thing. And we're very, very far from that in many parts of the world. Yes?
I feel like in a sense, if poverty was kind of abolished, slavery might be abolished.
Yeah. Yeah, it is absolutely because of poverty that people sell their children into prostitution. I was in Jamaica and was propositioned by a prostitute, and I declined, just so you know. And she turned to what appeared to be an 8-year-old girl next to her and said, well, what about her? And I think it was probably her daughter. And I walked away thinking, man, how poor does someone have to be to prostitute their child? But at the other end of it, it is recognizing how privileged, what a privileged life I've led and what a comfortable life I've led. I once heard a speaker say, Paul, you can never know what it means to be poor. And what he meant by that was, even if I lost everything, had no income whatsoever, I have had advantages that poor people never have that I will still have. An education, resources, other things like that, a network of people. And so he said, even if we take away all your money, you could never know what it's really like to be poor. And that's absolutely true. And so, but with that great privilege, I think, comes responsibility. Whether that responsibility is sharing what we have with the poor or speaking out on behalf of the poor, we need, the Church of Jesus Christ should be a voice for a more just world. I mentioned this in chapel, that the two things Jesus talks most about are the kingdom of God and money. Now I heard somebody, 3 different times in 1 year, I heard pastors say in 3 different churches, Jesus talks more about money than anything else, and all 3 of them went on to say, therefore tithe. But actually the only time Jesus talks about the tithe is to say to the Pharisees, you give a tithe of mint and cumin, but neglect justice for the needy. And none of these 3 pastors talked about that, neglecting justice for the needy part, just the tithe part. Now, I'm not speaking against tithing by any means, but I am saying Jesus does talk a lot about money and a lot about wealth, but he does so in the context of economic justice and looking out for the poor. And that's what our churches should be preaching, and that's what the church should be fighting aggressively for, I think.
So, thinking about your particular calling and what you've learned about being in Guatemala,
Yeah.
how do you see your calling, the semester program in Guatemala, addressing some of the oppression within that area of Antigua and Guatemala City?
Yeah, part of my calling is to help students see, and again, to let them figure out where I go from here. In January, we built, and this is an example of what I mean by poverty. I mentioned this in chapel on Monday, but one of the homes we rehabbed was for a woman named Olivia, and Olivia works from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. And has to walk an hour each to and from work, an hour to work, an hour back, and she lives up in the mountains. I would die halfway up the mountains if I had to walk up that mountain, because my asthma and everything, well, and a little bit of weight and other things. But every day. So she leaves her house at 5 and gets back at 6. 5 in the morning, gets back at 6. And she gets 20 quetzales a day, which is $2.50 for spending 11 hours making tortillas. And so we, a couple different people, put up the money for the materials, and we rehabbed her house. Olivia's in her mid-40s. She has had 10 children, 7 of whom survived, and 3 of whom are now living with her, and she had 1 makeshift bed that kind of thrown together a mattress, and all 4 people slept in that 1 bed. And so we rehabbed her house and then bought her two beds, so they only had to sleep 2 to a bed. And then we built another house for a man who, from the ground up, who had lost his wife and his house in a hurricane. And it's really, that's charity, not justice. Does that make sense? And I don't want to give the impression I'm speaking against charity, but charity does not change the dynamics that create poverty. I have John Perkins. Do you guys know the name John Perkins? He's fond of saying, you've heard the saying, give a man a fish, you give him a meal, teach him to fish, you feed him for life. He's saying, don't bother teaching me to fish if you're not going to give me access to the pond. And for the vast majority of those living in the third world, it's not a matter of ignorance. They know how to fish. It's a matter of access to the pond. And again, as I spoke about in chapel, in 1954, the government of Guatemala was trying to give people more access by land reform, but because the land they were redistributing belonged to United Fruit Company, which today goes by the name Chiquita, the U.S. CIA sponsored an invasion of Guatemala in 1954 and overthrew that government and installed a pretty brutal dictator, and 36 years of civil war has ensued. 200,000 people killed, 50,000 disappeared, 2 million displaced, because someone was trying to do redistribution of land, which ironically is what Jesus talks about in Luke 4 when he says the acceptable year of the Lord. A land reform act, year of Jubilee, would fall under that heading. And that's not the only time that's happened in Latin America. Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in the 80s, and in all 3 cases it's the U.S. that's made sure that things stay the way they are because they want to look out for our economic interests. And yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Taking on structural inequality seems like such a daunting task.
It is.
What initiatives, can we and people with more power, opportunity to fix it, take?
Yeah, I think, because it's a daunting task, you often feel like you're tilting at windmills, to use the Don Quixote metaphor, and you sometimes are. I once read an interview with Ingmar Bergman, the Swedish film director, and he was saying what a remarkable thing it is for the mason worker in the old cathedrals that are 1,000 years old to lay that first cornerstone, knowing that he'll never see the cathedral completed. Salisbury Cathedral, for example, took over 100 years to build. And I say that because we are all about quick fixes in American culture. Does that make sense? We're the people that brought the world fast food and the 1-minute manager and all of that stuff. You have to be in it for the long haul. And I recognize that when I die, poverty will still exist, racism will still exist, but if we're this much closer to what we're supposed to be, then, and I feel like I've done my part, the best I can do. And so one of the things that's absolutely critical is to recognize that you're just playing one small piece in a larger sweep of history. And it's easy to despair and say, you know, the poor you'll have with you always, but the poor are probably, in some cases at least, better off than they were in some countries. Similarly, you know, people at one point said racism will never change. Well, in my lifetime, racism still exists, but some of the structural changes for equality have been really remarkable changes in a relatively short period of time. And so things can happen, but you have to recognize that you've got to be in it for the long haul. And the hard part is you're not going to see those easy rewards coming. You know, I was excited when we lobbied on Capitol Hill about the minimum wage increase. I don't think we did it, but we were one of the voices. Unfortunately, right after minimum wage increase, so did gas prices. So any workers that had to drive very far to work saw their minimum wage increase gobbled up at the gas tank. So we're probably back where we were before the minimum wage increase in some ways. And so small victories, and sometimes local. It's easier, I mean, if you're trying to fix global structural inequality, that's a lot to take on. And there are people who are doing that. Bread for the World lobbies on behalf of hunger issues around the globe, and they do a great job at that. But sometimes it may mean just locally taking on one issue, focusing on that, and getting it done. I mentioned my daughter worked for an organization in Florida, in St. Petersburg, called FAST, Faith in Action for Strength Together. And I like the model of congregation-based community organizing, and it's actually found its way into El Salvador, not yet in Guatemala. But she worked with 32 different congregations, Catholic churches, Protestant churches, Jewish synagogues, and every year those people from the 32 congregations would get together, define the 3 most important issues for the community, split into groups that would research what other communities had done, and they have an action. And what they call an action is 2,000 people from this organization show up, and the mayor's invited, the chief of police is invited, the superintendent of schools is invited, and they make their presentations before these people and say, we want you to say yes or no. And then afterwards they give them time to explain, but initially it's just, yep, I'll support it, no I won't, that's all they want to hear. If they say yes, there's thunderous applause. If they say no, there's deafening silence. But then they've started a conversation, and in some cases they've had these victories where congregations have come together, and I think that's part of what can happen, where you can organize to have a little more power than one individual congregation would have. And even though some are Jewish and Catholic and Protestant, you can probably agree on affordable housing, you know, kind of cuts across religious differences. And I think, my own sense is, for far too long we've let some of our differences divide us far more than they should, and prevent us from working together on issues that would benefit whole communities. That's just one model, but there are a lot of different models of how people are doing things to transform. And part of what I've been doing this last year, years ago I had a group of students that came to me and said, we're going to move into Jackson, and we want to live in Jackson, we want to minister to people who are living in one of the poorest communities in Jackson. Would you meet with us and give us ideas on how we should do this? Because I used to live in that same neighborhood and pastored an interracial church there. And I said, I'll give you tip number 1. For the first 6 months, listen. Don't go. There are way too many missions groups that go in doing what they're prepared to do best, whether or not it's what the community wants or needs. And so the incarnational model, Jesus spent 30 years preparing for 3 years of ministry. And I said, just move into the community and listen. Have any of you guys been to Lawndale Community Church? And I think it's a great model of a church that basically said to the community around it, tell me where it hurts, and then we'll live out of that. We will do our best, and they've done housing programs and health care and the hip-hop service and Hope House, where they're doing substance abuse recovery. And basically they've listened to the community and said, now that I've listened to your hurt, what does it mean for me to be a follower of Christ in this context? And I think that's probably the big solution. And part of that means we need more voices on Capitol Hill or in the centers of power. And I think this is a good time to do that. Whatever you think of Occupy Wall Street, it started a conversation. It's the time when churches should be speaking up and saying, we need a better economic system. We need a different economic system. And by different, I don't mean we need socialism or something. We need a better version of capitalism, and one that is more just and better treatment of the poor. And so it'll be interesting to see how that dialogue plays out in the upcoming election. From what I've seen so far, I'm a little skeptical, but...
So, you know, we hear sometimes where we should, like a Dole company that might be down in Guatemala,
yeah,
boycott to make our, here in America, to make our needs known. But down there, it seemed like
yeah,
some of those guys are like, no, because they're given jobs that wouldn't normally be there.
exactly.
It's not fair. So
And that's what workers have said. Please don't boycott, because then we'll lose the jobs we have. There are examples. Nike, for example, this same report in 2000 said Phil Knight of Nike made $67 million as CEO of Nike. Michael Jordan got $25 million for endorsing Nikes. That's more than the whole Southeast Asian workforce got for making the Nikes. And there was enough of an outcry over that. Phil Knight had never been to any of the factories, never visited the factories once, never seen the work conditions, any of that, just $67 million to be CEO of Nike. And when he stepped down as CEO, in his last annual report, he said, we dropped the ball on this, on the working conditions and sweatshop labor and all of that. We should have paid more attention to it. And they've made some changes. One of the changes is they've agreed to publish the addresses of the sweatshops. There are no factories in the U.S., but there are factories in about 40 different countries around the world. And in the past, and I should be clear, Nike doesn't own any factories at all. They subcontract with other people who own factories. And that allows them some distance. Hey, we're not the ones doing this. It's that we hired this person, and that's what they're doing, and so forth. But by publishing the addresses, it allows people who are dogging the sweatshop issue to visit those factories and to ask the tough questions. And little by little, they've been pushed to improve. And part of the problem is, I did an exercise. This is in the video, but I don't have to show the video to tell you this. It's a video about Gap and Nike in Southeast Asia. And there's one spot where someone's saying, well, on this line, we will produce 1,000 Nike sweatshirts today. And he's showing about 20 workers. What would a Nike sweatshirt sell for? How much? $40? $30 to $40? Okay. So you have $40 times 1,000 sweatshirts equals $40,000. And you have 20 workers producing that, and they tell us earlier in the video that the 20 workers get $2 a day. And so we have 20 workers times $2 equals $40, leaving $39,960. Does that strike you as a reasonable? But then the question I ask my students is, if we paid 2 cents more per sweatshirt, they could double the wages of the workers. 2 cents more per sweatshirt and workers' wages could be doubled. But what are the odds that if we pay 2 cents more per sweatshirt, it's going to end up in the hands of the workers? And they're wise enough to see that that's highly unlikely to happen, but that's where the pressure has to occur. I mean, I wouldn't notice 2 cents more per sweatshirt. It would make no difference to me at all. It would change their lives fundamentally, but you have to challenge those in power. Kind of the model of Nathan standing before David, thou art the man. And that's where prophetic voice becomes so important. One of the quotes I quote most often is Martin Luther King, who said, "The judgment of God is upon the church, for its failure to be true to its prophetic mission. The church must recapture its prophetic zeal, or it will become a social club without spiritual or moral authority. And I think we're seriously at risk there. And by prophetic zeal, he means like Amos, saying, you sell the needy for a pair of sandals, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. And that's why I'm so excited to see us taking on this issue for Focus this year, that I hope it's a first step towards this faith community really beginning to ask the tough questions about justice, and economic justice in particular. One of the other things I mentioned in chapel, if you weren't there, the first time I was in Latin America, I was in Nicaragua and attending a Catholic Mass, and my Spanish is pretty terrible. So I sat there reading a Spanish New Testament, and I read passages that I'd memorized in English. And I got to one of the Beatitudes that says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. In English, I'd learned it after righteousness. In Spanish, it says, por justicia, Justicia. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be filled. And the Greek word has both meanings. Diakosune is the Greek word, and it means both righteousness and justice. But we lost something in translation when we left out the justice part in the English translation. And we need to put it back. I mean, we need that. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be filled. Other questions? Yes?
So, should we or should we not like boycott products that are
Maybe selectively. And what I've done is, if I buy the product, write the people and say, even if I don't buy it, write them and say, I don't want to buy this product because of this. There's a certain grocery store here in Jackson that I've never set foot in because I don't like their labor practices. And I support grocery stores that are treating workers better in some ways. And it's the tough thing, because I agree with what they're saying. You don't want them to lose the few jobs they have. And so boycotts may be a problem in that arena. But finding ways to put pressure on becomes important, I think, however we can do that. And there's some corporations that, Ben & Jerry's is one that comes to mind, that has really thought at every step about how they can be most responsible. Now, eventually they sold out to a large multinational, and so a lot of their ethical standards went by the wayside. But the struggle is balancing the needs of stockholders with other stakeholders. And the other stakeholders include workers, consumers, people who live near the factories. They're all affected by the decisions that corporations make. Whether or not those corporations pay taxes affects us, because if they're not helping us reduce the deficit, you and I are. And either through cutting services that we're used to or paying more in taxes ourselves. And so things that will hold people and corporations accountable, and we need voice in those areas. And there are examples of some real wins. One of the ones in Guatemala, one of my close friends, Hector Castañeda, was a founder of a group called Coverco. And what they do is they go into organizations, sweatshops and things like that, and use their own code of conduct. So this is what they say they're going to do, and they investigate and say, are you living up to your own code of conduct? And to agree to do this, they have to have 24/7 access. They can go in, they can look at the books, they can interview workers. And Liz Claiborne was one of the companies that contracted with Coverco, and they went in and wrote their report, published it on the internet. So it's now transparent, and that's one of their conditions too. And Liz Claiborne became the first company in Guatemala to say if workers want to form a union, they ought to have the right to form a union. People who had tried to form a union earlier had been murdered. And so Liz Claiborne was one of the first to say, all right, this will help bring some kind of balance of power where we get them to recognize we need to make a profit, but then we listen to them about the wages and working conditions and so forth. And so it's one example. of where someone was able to go in and without the boycott, basically try to get better conditions and fairer conditions for workers.
In a follow-up to her question, is there a spot on the internet where we can go and learn who's supporting and give a kudo letter versus who's not?
I think Mary mentioned a website last night that they're going to talk about at, I think, the 11 o'clock or 1:30 session, something like that. But yeah, it's hard, and in terms of purchasing, it's hard to keep clean. That is, our produce, everything, slave wages all over the place. And we benefit from that. We have cheap stuff here because of how little people are paid in other parts of the globe. I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time and your questions. I see people standing at the door, so next session begins in 8 minutes if you have to travel very far.